So we're about to start our expert webinar on finance process automation. We'll be looking at what our latest survey is showing is happening in the field and reaction to that. People are just joining us now. If you'd like to say hi and introduce yourself in the chat room, we can see where you are now just before we get started, and then we'll get going with our team. So welcome everybody. Today our expert panel will be looking at where things stand with finance process automation. We have the data analysis of our latest survey, which shows where a range of organizations are in their automation journey, and some of the findings are a bit surprising and some are more expected. Our experts will be offering their take on the data and also information about what to do depending on where you are in your automation journey. Our IFOL Education panel are our experts responsible for delivering live virtual masterclasses each month. And we'll be providing you with a best practice guide following this session, so there's no need to make any notes if you don't want to. Please put any questions you have in the chat, we'll pick them up. We'll also be running a couple of polls, and I'd ask you to vote in those if you would. I'm Sue Beardsmore, and today with us we have Rod Chadwick, an accountant by training, holding senior roles in finance for 25 years, a former head of process improvement at the Royal Mail in the UK, an expert on automation and one of our IFOL tutors. Hi, Rod. Hello. We're also joined by Blanca McGrory. She's an AP manager with the Provincial Health Services Authority in Canada, previously with Lush Cosmetics North America. Her entire career has been in an accounting environment with well over 10 years in AP. She had her first introduction to automation around 2010 and has experience of a whole range of implementations. Hi, Blanca. And Gary Stevens has been involved in finance in the private and public sector for over 40 years. He transformed the Accounts Payable team at Aberdeen City Council and now works with organisations to strengthen AP teams and overall performance. And he's got plenty of experience of automating processes. He's also one of our regular tutors. Hi. Hi. So we're going to kick off, first of all, with a poll to see where you fit into our research. So overall, do you think your team has modern and effective processes across finance operations? Just one choice: yes, you do, no, you don't, or you're unsure. So overall, do you think your team has modern and effective processes across finance operations? A single choice: yes, no, or you're unsure. And we'll wait for the results of that to come up in front of us and see what we think about that. So, yes or unsure, nobody's fessing up to no, so that's good to see. So overall, modern and effective processes, 60%, unsure, 40%. Thanks very much indeed for that. So let's turn to the panel. And our recent research has shown that 2/5, 40% of global respondents don't think their finance team has modern and efficient processes. So does that surprise you? Does that statistic surprise you? Who'd like to kick off?
I'll start. Not really, I think is the honest answer. And I think it's interesting, the little poll there just sort of backed that up pretty much exactly. I think it's an interesting one because paradoxically, often the teams that are in the greatest need of process improvement are those that are actually the last to do it, because they oftentimes are having to do manual process that are very, very labour intensive, take an awful lot of their time up, and don't have time to step back from those manual tasks that they're doing to actually look at it from a holistic level, end to end, to see where the process improvements are required. And it's having that point of reference and the time to actually look at it, I think, is often the barrier to people undertaking some of the work.
And Blanca, to that overall question, is it actually a bit more nuanced than that? Are some areas of finance becoming more modern and efficient, and actually some areas being left behind? What's your experience of that?
I think that in my experience, that's probably the case. I think it's probably driven by the needs of the business. Like, let's say, for example, I've had some experience in AR as well, and I'm finding that like more revenue generating departments are a lot of the times more prioritized than, like, let's say, for example, procurement or AP. And also, I think it's also driven by, compliance issues. So yeah, so for example, like government compliances, you can't necessarily get away with that. So if there is going to be a priority, it's probably those areas.
Okay, Gary, what would you add to that?
I think there needs to be a desire as well to drive some change and improvements. With my local government hat on, it was quite easy for me when I took on my role managing AP to see how badly we were actually doing against other local authorities, councils in Scotland, and we needed to change. So that desire was there from me as a senior manager, and I had to get the buy-in from directors, etc., as well, which thankfully they did. So that was the starting point for me. Once we had that buy-in and the desire, we were able to push forward.
Are some areas of finance simply easier to modernise than others? What's your view on that, Rod?
It's a very difficult question because it does tend to differ, the complexity sort of area by area. But yes, certainly pockets tend to lend themselves more easily to it. So areas within AP, for example, I mean, nowadays when you're talking about things like invoice processing and the whole area of matching is the software packages available are significantly easier and more accessible than they used to be. So and it tends to be quite self-contained, so those areas do tend to be ones that people will perhaps start on. But again, it very much depends on the scale and complexity of the company. Sometimes you can have places that are processing millions of invoices across lots of different countries where it becomes much more complex. So it's an interesting question, a difficult one to sort of give you a firm answer to.
Sometimes, sorry, Sue.
No, go.
Sometimes it's difficult. The integration of different parts of systems. You've got purchase to pay process. You've got procurement at the front end. You could be using a specific portal for your procurement. You've got your financial system sitting in the middle, and you've got how you're working your automation within the AP. Trying to get those three to work together in tandem to drive those efficiencies. That's where some of the work can be quite difficult and challenging, but it's not unsurmountable.
Blanca, have you come across any surprises in your experience, things that you would have expected to be more automated perhaps, and it's simply not happening?
Well, definitely. I think that, like when I came into PHSA, for example, I'm quite surprised that a lot of our vendors are not being paid by direct deposit. And sometimes even employees, like within our space, I think that is within the accounts payable space. The payment is probably one of the easier areas to automate. I think that the banks have a lot of different options now for payments, and you even have third-party solutions who are able to walk you through that. So we've made strides in that area.
Okay. So the top three from the research that's been done and the analysis we've got, the top three most efficient processes were identified as taxation, supplier payments, and billings. Now, same kind of question. Is this a surprise, or why do you think it might be the case? Rod?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I would have expected to see. And it touches really on what Blanca mentioned earlier. Compliance is obviously something that you have to do, and you have no choice. And so anything to do with taxation will tend to get a high profile. And the other two of basically money in, money out, it's all cash flow, which is obviously essential for every business. So it gets a lot of attention. So those areas, I think, are always going to get that top priority when you're starting out as an area that's going to get done first. So yeah, no great surprises from that.
And effectively, that's sort of an outside, especially in the case of taxation, say, that's an outside organisation almost driving what organisations need to do to respond to it. So presumably then resource and staffing mean that they leave the other areas alone. What examples and experience do you have of this kind of thing? Gary, or maybe?
Well, in public sector, you know, there is obviously a big requirement, like all businesses, to make sure that you get your tax returns in on time. And a lot of what drives this is potential fines if they're late, for example. Plus, when you're processing your orders or your invoices, here in the UK, we have different rates of value-added tax, VAT, for example. So you need to be making sure that those are correct when you're processing, and those need to be checked so that you're paying the right VAT or you're charging the right VAT. So there's a lot of drivers around that. So as Rod said, I wasn't surprised to see taxation being the top, because, you know, if you get that wrong, you're in trouble.
Is that your experience too, Blanca? Is that what you found?
Yes, definitely. I think when I was at Lush, for example, it's not necessarily just the tax, but also like business licenses. And it's not as much in Canada, but in the States, which we also covered, they have different levels. Like we have the federal and then the state and the city, and sometimes you have the township. It's just different levels of taxation. So it does require a lot more attention. So if your processes are not efficient, it's so easy to fall and go against compliance, which can cost the company a lot of money just in interest and penalties alone.
So in those areas, it's easy for a company, an organization, to see what they need to do and how it benefits them, which is why they drive it forward. How do you move them to some of the other areas? In a moment, we'll look at the 3 most inefficient areas that people have identified, but how do you persuade some of the less fashionable areas, shall we say, to move into automation? What are the reasons?
Oh, go on, sorry, carry on, Brian.
I'm feeling that right now. I think in a way that the pandemic has kind of helped in that regard, like with people working from home, like unfortunately in where I am right now, in my current environment, we're not automated at all in that fashion, or I shouldn't say at all. Like, there are minuscule automation, but not necessarily like invoice approval. We're still very reliant on like Outlook, which it could be like like the death of your invoices, essentially, if you just fully rely on that. But I think that there's a need, definitely. And I'm a big proponent of sustainability. So if you want to be able to survive in this type of environment, you need to be able to look at your processes and get up to speed with making sure you're able to support the business needs and your customers as well.
Okay. Gary, anything to add there?
No, I would just echo what's been said there. Yeah. Nothing to add, really.
Okay, so the 3 most inefficient finance processes, let's have a look at those and give us your thoughts on those and why you might want to get involved in automating them. Purchase orders, invoice processing, and invoice approval. So if they're the least popular, do you think that AP is being left behind in terms of efficient and effective processing there? And we've touched quite a lot on why that would be the case, but what's the case for automating?
Well, I think looking at those 3, I'm not surprised. That's your purchase to pay cycle, really, your purchase orders, invoice processing and approval. I think one of the drivers is just how you're actually performing within those 3 areas. I mean, purchase order, it can be something as simple as the fact that you're not raising them properly, you've got price differences, or you're not goods receipting when your orders are coming in. That in effect then leads to mismatches within your invoice processing. So all 3 really tie in with each other, and invoice approvals as well. So I think, regular reviews of how your processes are doing and how your performance is within those 3 would be the drivers to bring in automation, really, as a starting point. Okay,
Blanca, what would you add?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I mean, I think in the last little while, the whole P2P process has been has gained a lot of attention. So I think that being able to capitalize on that and looking at like what Gary said, the drivers of of the process. A lot of the times too, I mean, like when invoices are not getting paid, the vendors are usually the first one to raise their hands and essentially, like hold your orders, your shipments. So being able to, like elevate that and escalate that kind of noise, for me, like I've been trying to capitalize on that and just making sure that, oh yeah, well, if we have this process, because a lot of the times it's actually stuck in the invoice approval, just that whole routing and all of those steps. That's usually where it's stuck. So being able to like highlight that and highlight the efficiencies that will be gained through automation can actually gain a lot of attention. My experience too right now is again, because of the pandemic, is now it's actually my own customers, like my own kind of business users who are actually asking, oh, do we have, can we somehow automate this? Do we have another option? And so, and it's good that they're asking because they themselves see that this process is just not sustainable. So we've been able to capitalize and really start on those conversations so that, like when the time comes and we're having to, sell it, they're already kind of, halfway bought in.
So there's more to do than just saying we're going to do it. You've talked about starting the conversation. You need to start the conversation, but presumably there are things you need to get in order before you're in a position to automate. What would some of those things be that people should be looking at?
I think it's actually reviewing your processes and cleaning up, because I think a lot of the misconception is that, once you automate, all of your problems are going to be solved, but that's not the case at all, right? Like I think a lot of the times actually it highlights the problem areas in your processes that you definitely need to address if you're going to automate. So I think that a lot of the times too is people are stuck on a certain area in the automation because it's a little overwhelming to kind of, break down the steps. And because I think a lot of the times this is their current process and they feel like they still have to follow that process when you're automating, but that's not the case at all, right? So it's being able to actually have an eye for what could be better, like how could this be? And so a lot of the times you're not going to be able to kind of walk through all those steps internally, and there is value in actually bringing in a consultant who has gone through that process, who has the different options and can look at which steps you can eliminate once you automate.
Okay, Gary, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think automation really is in some ways is the last piece of the jigsaw. I think you've got to make sure you've got your foundations in place first. And that for me was looking at how my team was set up, how we had a dedicated accounts payable team eventually from a decentralized to centralized team. You have to have a way of getting your invoices around your organization if there's mismatches electronically, not via paper because they'll get lost. And from there, you can then start to get the building blocks together to then start looking at how you can use automation to drive through the efficiencies within that setup. So if that for me, I can't stress enough that e-invoicing or automation won't work unless you've got those foundations in place to start with.
And is that what sometimes puts people off, the time that they need to devote to putting those building blocks in place? Is that why it just gets ignored some of the time?
Possibly. But I think if you work with your ERP, your finance system providers, they can do a lot of the heavy lifting and the work that's required to bring in automation. And I think that's sometimes missed when organizations are looking at bringing in automation. They think it's a lot of work going to be placed on them. But I think, as Blanca said, speak to the providers. They've probably gone through this many times with other organizations, so they've got a template in effect to start working with you. So speak to them as well. That's a key thing as well within the process.
Rod, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I definitely echo what's been said. I mean, simplification and standardization are your first two parts, and I would say that a small amount of knowledge of something like lean as a toolkit is tremendously helpful. And you can get, and it doesn't have to be complicated or expensive. I mean, it's really common sense stuff, but it gives you a framework to start looking at your processes, to identify where the waste is in those processes. And the act of looking at that in itself is a tremendously valuable piece of once you understand those processes, and I totally agree with Gary. You know, the automation is the last part of the jigsaw. An awful lot of the benefit you'll get is just from doing what you're doing now better, with better better manual processes before you start looking at the tools that you need to automate it. But there's other things around there as well, things like making sure, and it's really simple stuff, but making sure you've got the right policies in place, the parameters and the expectations that you've got within your company, that the targetry that you need to hit is in place so that everybody understands what they're trying to achieve and it's not aimless. There's no point running age creditor reports if you don't know what you're actually trying to aim for, because then that drives the actions that you need to go through to improve those measures. So having a credit policy, a delegation of authority policy, collections, age creditors, all those sorts of things, real bread and butter. You get those in place, then anytime you start to look at automation, it makes it significantly easier, quicker and cheaper.
Okay, so just before we move off this, we looked at the three most efficient, the three most inefficient in respondees' thoughts. Do you think that AP, as a general thing, with all your experience, you three, is it being left behind in terms of efficient and effective processing? Or is that just a perception sometimes in specific companies?
I think certainly in my experience, it is often one that gets done later for some of the reasons that we talked about earlier, and it's perhaps not seen as quite as sexy and giving you bigger returns as you might get with some of the others. But I think that's why it's important to look at the end-to-end process and understand what the benefit is of doing these things. And I think the trouble with AP is it often tends to get looked at just in terms of resource. If we automate this, we can save a few heads and save a few £1,000 here and there. But actually, it's much more wide-ranging than that, and it covers some of the stuff that Blanca just talked about in terms of making sure that you actually maintain your supply chain. Because if you're not paying your suppliers on time and keeping them happy and keeping that whole thing moving, the implications on the business are huge. Much more than just 2 or 3 heads in your AP department. So it's kind of looking wider, I think, at the business case for automation and being a bit more imaginative about understanding the reasons why you want to do something. But I do think it's changing. I do think it is now getting much more attention, and the tools to enable you to do it are much more readily available.
I was going to say that presumably the more that they're used, the more available they become, and presumably a bit cheaper as well. So yeah. Everybody's agreed there, right? Okay, well, the 3 most common challenges from the survey that we have faced by respondents were really clear. Manual processing time delays, which we've mentioned, errors from manual processing, and lengthy invoice approval. So we know that process automation can help with all of those challenges, but what other things can help? I suppose some of the bread and butter and the building blocks you were talking about, perhaps we could have your review of what helps. Blanca, would you like to start?
I think those definitely are the top 3. I think also getting, like Gary was talking earlier about getting your invoices centralized, like definitely, I'm just looking at my environment right now, and invoices are still coming from all sorts of different directions. However, it's not necessarily that easy to just change that. It's not a matter of blasting an email and saying that from now on all invoices go here, because they are quite sensitive in terms of how they look at their invoices and so on. So yeah, I think one of them is definitely that whole sort of change management of how they view the whole process, like what they own and what other people should own.
Okay, Gary.
Well, I think for me, the word that jumps out there is manual. I think that's the where you're going to get problems if you've got manual processes. It does slow things down. There's human error going to be built in there as well. I mean, the first two, the manual processing time delays and errors in manual processing, that is then going to lead to number 3, which is lengthy invoice approval, because you're going to have to keep passing them back forward. And if it's manual, it's in paper form, easy for those invoices to get lost across the organization. So your suppliers will then be getting paid later. So that is a red light that should be saying to you, right, we need to start looking at all of those areas and why this is happening, and look to improve the procedures. So yeah, basically manual equals delays.
Rod, anything to add?
Not really. I totally agree. I would just say that, I suppose, just to emphasize what I said earlier, is the act of mapping out your processes is definitely a tremendously helpful step in doing that, if you haven't already done it. And it's one of those things that, again, it's a really simple thing to do, but it just highlights very starkly on the page, you know, where the issues are in a process, and you can start to see how many steps are in there and how many you should have compared to what you're currently doing. And I think that, for me, is the first step to improvement.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions. One, I think, is massive, but I'm still going to throw it at you anyway. It would be interesting to hear your views. But for me, Boko, how effective is AP? I mean, I'm guessing the automation process rather than accounts payable, I think.
That's a big question.
I'm only going to give you a little while on it, but
Yeah.
maybe first.
I mean, I suppose just in terms of automation, I suppose just in terms of stats, I think that the last benchmarking report that I saw suggested that in terms of invoice processing, which is kind of, if you like, that's the engine, if you like, of AP. If you've got a mature automated set of processes, then the amount of invoices that can be processed sort of per person, I think, is around about 23,000 per person per year. So it's in terms of how effective the automation is, have a look at your own organization, have a look at what your own stats are, and then, you know, have a look at how far you are away from, and that'll perhaps give you a feel for the level of improvement that can be made.
I think you can look at it supplier on supplier as well, in terms of when we automated our top 100, 120 suppliers, we worked through them gradually. So we had some of our big ones where we were finding 80% match rate first time, absolutely brilliant. So that was a lot of invoices where we didn't even have to touch them. Other suppliers, it was maybe down to 20, 30, 40%. So that's when you have to start then assessing, why is that the case that they're so low? Where are the problems? Look at the process, where there might be issues with purchase order. Do you need to bring in thresholds, which might allow you to get a higher percentage of invoices through, that sort of thing. So it's really just doing some analysis of your own data that you're getting off your system to see how effective your AP actually is. Okay,
Blanca, any markers you'd flag up as a mark of effectiveness?
Yeah, I mean, I think if vendors are constantly calling in because they haven't been paid, then that's a sure mark that, you know, like something is not working properly. But yeah, I think that definitely looking at your stats, like say for us, for example, I mean, I think our, you know, taxes is a big area, like just in terms of, you know, like VAT, or what we call goods and services tax, essentially. That's kind of, you know, one area that has created a lot of noise for us. So yeah, just looking at sort of where how invoices are being held up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fine. One more question now. Due to the need of the increase in automation in financial aspects of most businesses, this is from Nicola, what changes bring to finance and accountancy employees in terms of skills and experience so that they can adapt and be ready sort of autonomously to go through any automation development? So what can you do for staff? What skills do they need? What development should be going in?
Yeah, really good question. And I think there's kind of two parts to that. One is around the actual process side of that, and certainly skills around sort of Lean Six Sigma type qualifications you can do to help you improve your analysis skills. I think business analysis skills become much more important. Also, inevitably, when you automate anything, it introduces change, quite significant amounts of change. So again, I would say change management skills are something that need to be really looked at and absolutely not ignored or underestimated at how important that is when you start to introduce change. Through to the other side of it, which is the more technical side of it in terms of automation. And for most people in the accountancy team, they don't necessarily need to be experts in the automation. They just need to know what it does and actually how to use it, as opposed to actually being a programmer as such. So it kind of depends on what it is that what area you want to focus in. But certainly the analysis and the change management skills are the two that I would say will stand you in very good stead.
I think as well, your automation will have mirrored or mapped your manual process. So really your staff should still know how the nuts and bolts of it all work. There will still be mismatched invoices. There will still be things that they need to deal with through automation that they were dealing with through the manual setup. Communication is really important as well, to make sure that staff are involved from the start in terms of how you're rolling out automation and what's going to happen, what the steps are, and also help and support as we move through those steps. And that might involve some training. And again, your provider will possibly come in and do some training for you as part of the setup. So those are quite important things as well.
Anything to add, Blanca?
Yeah, I think, like as an entry level person going into accounting and accounts payable, like there are the soft skills that I always look for. And one of the things that I always tell my staff is, if it's causing you problems, raise your hand. Because I think that's always, because if they're, just coming off, like university and starting out school, they may not necessarily be aware of all of these automation pieces. But I think that there is an inherent, attitude about being able to question processes. And I think that's a good start. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Can I also take the opportunity to bang our own drum, because IFOL have got some great certification programs which cover things like automation, and you can get certified, and that's now a really good thing to have within AP. Many years ago, there was no certification programs about, so you can get qualified AP staff now, which is a great step forward.
Thanks, Gary. One question, and if I could ask you to address it relatively quickly so we can just move on to a couple of final points. Again, from Nicola, if you can split businesses between having a good level of automation versus a low level of automation, which are the key aspects or areas which you would see as defining that division based on your knowledge and experience? So I guess I'm going to come to Rod and say,
I'm just trying to understand exactly what that question's trying to address.
Okay. So
if we're talking about, yeah, go on, Gary.
I think it's split businesses. That's where I'm sort of maybe trying to understand what's meant by that.
I think it's just if you can compare, a good level of automation with a bad level.
Oh, I see.
Oh, I see. Right.
Would you say was that good level? I mean, end to end, or does it?
I think a good level of automation, I suppose, is what's appropriate for your business. First of all, I mean, and again, it depends on the scale and size and complexity of business that you have, and that will be different in each case. But in terms of what defines that division between the good versus a low level is, again, it's about I think it's about moving towards where you want to get to in terms of your performance.
Yeah.
And use that as your benchmark and to drive the level of automation that you need or don't need. But ultimately, it will come down to the business case. So all types of automation will have some cost associated with them, and it's a question of whether or not that costs in. But I think that's why it's so important to get that level of understanding between your processes and the simplification and standardization first. Because quite often you do that first and actually think, what, that part of it doesn't really need too much more beyond that because it's working well for our business.
Okay, thanks.
I'm not sure whether that answers the question, to be honest. I'm not entirely certain what the answers are looking for.
Okay, well, I'll see if they come back to us and see how we go. But meantime, I'm going to ask everybody to join in another poll. So do you think that your finance team needs to review and update your finance processes? So again, just one answer, yes, no, or unsure. So do you in your organization think that your finance team needs to review and update your finance processes? And we'll get the answer about what people are thinking about that in just a couple of seconds. And then we can see how much work there is to do or otherwise. So do you think that your finance team needs to review and update your finance processes? A single choice, yes, no, or unsure. And, oh gosh, 86% think that they do, and one person is unsure. That's out of a small number of respondees, but even so, I think it shows what people are thinking. So, from our research, less than half of finance teams regularly review their processes throughout the year. 17% review them once a year, 11% every 2 to 3 years, and 8% say they never review their processes. So you guys, in terms of best practice, are people generally, organizations, doing enough in the review stakes? What would you suggest they do and why?
I think what I would say is I think that shows no from that from that response, which I don't think is it's very encouraging in one respect, because I think it shows that there's a need to continually review. And I think I would answer this question slightly at a tangent, that rather than saying there's a specific time length that you should be reviewing your process. I think for me, the thing that's really important to try and get in there is a culture of continuous improvement. Because once you've looked at your processes, you map them and you put in a nice document and they sit on a shelf, what you don't want to happen is they just sit there getting dusty until 12 months time people dust them off and say, right, let's have a look at them again. Ideally you want to make a continuous improvement culture within that business, so they're living documents that people are looking at all the time. Make it, where I'm working now, for example, we've made it part of people's objectives to find an area of inefficiency within their process and then to do something about it. And that becomes a bonus worthy objective. And I think that's that sort of little things like that can make a big difference, and also making someone responsible for driving it through. So have somebody within the organization whose responsibility is to drive that continuous improvement.
Blanca, what would you add to that? Anything?
No, I think I completely agree. And I think one of the usually when you implement a project, I think one of the key thing that is missing is the feedback, is the post implementation review. And I think that is really key, because a lot of, also especially when a lot of these projects have like a phase 1, a phase 2, so to be able to actually do a post implementation review, you can then take in what you've learned and implement it in future phases. I think that's important.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to ask Gary to kick off on this, because we're coming close to the end. The biggest barrier to process improvement was seen as a lack of priority. So how would you suggest our respondents make this more of a priority within their organizations and actually build that case for change?
I mean, I think it leads on to some of the stats we were getting with the last poll. There's definitely a high number of finance people that feel that there's a need for their processes to be reviewed and updated in some respects. So it's how those staff are actually listened to. And I think finance managers, directors, if there's a strong message coming from staff at the coalface that are doing the work day to day, that there's problems or there's issues, then they need to sit down with them and work through what those issues are and how they can take things forward. Don't ignore it, as unfortunately some finance directors, the higher up the tree you get, they don't think they've got a problem. So that message really needs to be put through strongly. And I think with AP, if you've got a reputational damage, for example, you're not paying your suppliers quickly enough, then there's a really good tool to move things forward with. Because if you've got unhappy suppliers, your reputation is going to be damaged. And it's no matter how well your company or organization are doing, if your AP team are not paying suppliers quickly enough, then that's a black mark against you, really. And you really need to improve on that.
And Blanca, that goes a little to your point, doesn't it? When you previously said ask questions, question the process, allow people to do that. Presumably that's a good pointer as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. And, you know, it's not even just, you know, like within a feed, right? Like, you know, when you're taking in the feedback from, you know, like your customers, your business users, that's sort of like a really good launching point into highlighting what the difficulties are in the current process.
Rod, final word.
Yeah, I would say there's two final points I'd make on that sort of those barriers. I think firstly, rather than saying, well, what's the business case for change for doing this, reframe the question and say, what's the business case? What happens if we don't do this? That's what another way of looking at it, which often gives you some very different answers. And in terms of the benefits, don't focus on the immediately obvious. So, for example, you might say, right, okay, look at all the things that you want to do in that particular team, whether it be AP or AR, but don't have the time because you don't have capacity because you're doing all these manual processes. Right? Imagine that you had that capacity because you're doing things on an automated basis. What would you do with that time and how valuable would that be? And that can often give you, you know, a significantly enhanced case for change rather than focusing on the things that immediately come to light.
Thanks very much indeed. And a word from people who've asked questions. Thank you for your answers. You've got them covered. So that's good. You did get there, Rod. So thanks all round to our panel of experts, Rod Chadwick, Gary Stevens, Blanca McGrory. And thanks to you for joining us. For more information on membership and the courses, some of which we've heard about today, please head to the IFOL website. And this webinar is available on demand on the IFOL website from tomorrow. So please feel free to share it with any colleagues who may be interested. And we'll send a link to top suggestions and a PDF best practice guide. Thanks again for joining us. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.